Eleanor Grayson had lived a quiet, uneventful life in her charming little cottage nestled at the edge of a sprawling suburban neighborhood. The house was more than just four walls and a roof to her. It was a piece of history, a legacy passed down through generations of her family. Every corner of the home held memories. The creaky wooden floors that sang underfoot, the hand-carved mantelpiece above the fireplace, and the garden where she spent countless afternoons tending to roses her grandmother once planted. Life was simple, predictable even, until one crisp autumn morning when an envelope arrived in the mail. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, just another bill or notice, perhaps something from the utility company. But as Eleanor opened it over her morning coffee, her hands froze midway to take a sip. The letter inside wasn't from any utility provider. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA, the governing body for the upscale gated community that surrounded her property. What caught her eye immediately was the bolded figure at the top, $45,000. Beneath it, in stern black and white text, was a demand for payment. According to the HOA, Eleanor owed 30 years' worth of unpaid dues, penalties, and interest fees, all stemming from what they claimed was her failure to comply with membership obligations. Eleanor blinked, certain she must have misread the document. 30 years? That didn't make sense. She'd been paying her annual HOA dues without issue ever since moving into the cottage 3 decades ago. Sure, her payments were modest compared to those of her neighbors, but that was because her property predated the entire subdivision. When developers built the modern community around her land in the 1980s, they explicitly assured her that her parcel would remain independent due to its historical significance. Her home wasn't part of their original plans. It existed long before bulldozers carved out cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns. But this letter painted a different picture. It accused Eleanor of neglecting her responsibilities, implying that she had somehow duped everyone into thinking she was exempt. The tone was cold, impersonal, almost accusatory, as if she were some deadbeat trying to freeload off the amenities funded by other residents. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. How could this happen? And why now, after all these years? She set the letter down on her kitchen table, staring at it like it might come alive and explain itself. Who did the HOA think she was? A cheat? A thief? At 72 years old, Eleanor had spent most of her life dedicated to books, teaching, and preserving the stories of others. Now here she was, being dragged into what felt like a nightmare ripped straight out of someone else's life. Overwhelmed but determined, Eleanor decided to dig deeper. She rummaged through drawers and filing cabinets, pulling out faded receipts and correspondence spanning decades. Each scrap of paper told a story. Proof of payments made, letters exchanged with former HOA presidents thanking her for cooperation, even handwritten notes confirming her unique status as a non-member resident. As she pieced together the evidence, a new emotion began to replace her shock. Anger. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an injustice. Someone had gotten things terribly wrong, or worse, deliberately twisted the truth. By the time evening fell, Eleanor sat back in her chair, surrounded by piles of documents. Outside, the golden light of sunset bathed her garden in warmth, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her mind. One thing was clear: she couldn't let this stand. Whatever battle lay ahead, Eleanor knew she had no choice but to fight. Not just for herself, but for the integrity of the home her ancestors had entrusted to her care. Eleanor's cottage wasn't just a house. It was a time capsule, a relic of an era long past. Built in 1923, it stood as a testament to simpler times when sprawling suburbs didn't exist and life moved at a slower pace. The story of the cottage began with her great-grandparents, who purchased the land shortly after World War I. They were immigrants chasing the American dream, determined to build something permanent in a world that often felt uncertain. With their own hands, they constructed the modest home using materials sourced from nearby mills and quarries. Every brick, every beam carried the weight of hope and hard work. Over the decades, the cottage became more than just shelter. It was a gathering place for family celebrations, quiet moments of reflection, and even community gatherings during tough times. Eleanor's grandmother turned the backyard into a vibrant garden filled with roses, lavender, and wildflowers, a tradition Eleanor continued faithfully. The house had weathered storms, economic downturns, and the passage of time, yet it remained standing, resilient, and proud. It was this legacy that made Eleanor so protective of her home, not because of its monetary value, but because of what it represented: roots, history, and identity. When developers arrived in the 1980s with plans to transform the surrounding area into a gated community, Eleanor initially resisted. She remembered attending town hall meetings where residents voiced concerns about losing access to open spaces and greenery. But the developers promised harmony between old and new. They assured Eleanor that her property would remain untouched, exempt from the rules and fees imposed on newer homes. After all, her land predated their plans by over half a century. In legal terms, it existed as a non-conforming parcel, meaning it didn't need to conform to the HOA's regulations unless she chose to do so voluntarily. At first, Eleanor appreciated the gesture. While her neighbors paid hefty dues to maintain swimming pools, tennis courts, and landscaped parks, she opted out of these luxuries. Her needs were simple: running water, electricity, and a road plowed during winter snows. To show goodwill, though, she agreed to pay a nominal fee each year to cover basic shared expenses like street lighting and trash collection. This arrangement worked seamlessly for years. Neighbors admired her quaint cottage, often stopping by to chat or ask questions about its history. Some even joked that living next to Eleanor felt like stepping back in time, a refreshing break from the cookie-cutter uniformity of the rest of the neighborhood. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Over the years, the HOA grew stricter, imposing rigid guidelines on everything from fence colors to mailbox designs. Newcomers barely acknowledged Eleanor's existence, dismissing her as an oddity rather than a neighbor. Meanwhile, Eleanor watched as towering McMansions replaced smaller homes, altering the character of the area forever. Still, she held on to her independence, finding comfort in knowing her cottage was protected by decades of agreements and promises. As Eleanor thought about the outrageous bill now sitting on her kitchen table, she couldn't help but feel betrayed. How could anyone look at her home, a piece of living history, and see only dollar signs? The developers had sworn to honor her property's unique status, yet here she was, being treated like just another homeowner guilty of skipping payments. The injustice gnawed at her. If the HOA thought they could rewrite history, they were sorely mistaken. Eleanor knew her home's story better than anyone, and she was ready to share it with the world if it meant setting things right. Eleanor wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, but this situation was unlike anything she'd ever faced. The $45,000 bill loomed over her like a dark cloud, and every time she glanced at it, her stomach churned. She couldn't let it stand, not without a fight. But where to begin? Eleanor had spent most of her life surrounded by books, not legal documents or bureaucratic red tape. Still, something inside her refused to give up. If there was one thing she'd learned from years of teaching and research, it was that knowledge was power. So, armed with determination and decades' worth of paperwork, Eleanor dove headfirst into unraveling the mystery. Her first step was to revisit the original agreements between her family and the developers who built the gated community. These documents were tucked away in an old filing cabinet in her study, yellowed with age but still legible. As she sifted through them, Eleanor felt a surge of relief. There it was, clear as day, a letter signed by the CEO of the development company, promising that her property would remain independent of the HOA's jurisdiction. It even included a clause stating that no future fees or penalties could be levied against her home unless she explicitly agreed to join the association. Eleanor's heart raced as she read the words aloud to herself. Your parcel is exempt from all membership obligations. Exempt. The word echoed in her mind, solidifying her resolve. But why, then, had the HOA sent her such a massive bill? Something didn't add up. Determined to get answers, Eleanor decided to dig deeper. She called the HOA office, hoping for clarity. After being transferred 3 times, she finally reached someone. A young-sounding woman named Lisa, who seemed frazzled and unprepared for Eleanor's questions. When pressed about the source of the bill, Lisa admitted that the HOA had recently hired a new management company to handle finances and billing. This revelation struck Eleanor as suspicious. Why would a third-party firm suddenly decide she owed 30 years' worth of dues? And how could they justify charging her for services she never used? The more Eleanor thought about it, the angrier she became. Someone, whether intentionally or carelessly, had made a grave mistake. To expose the truth, she needed help. That's when she remembered Jack Miller, a retired lawyer who lived 2 streets over. Jack had served as the HOA president years ago, before stepping down due to disagreements with the board's direction. He was known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude, qualities Eleanor admired. Though they weren't close friends, she figured he might be willing to lend a hand, or at least point her in the right direction. Summoning her courage, Eleanor knocked on Jack's door one chilly afternoon. She explained her predicament, showing him the incriminating letter and the stack of documents she'd gathered. Jack listened intently, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "This doesn't look good," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen some shady stuff from the HOA over the years, but this takes the cake." Jack agreed to help Eleanor draft a formal rebuttal to the HOA, outlining the errors in their claim and demanding an immediate retraction of the bill. Together, they pored over state laws governing homeowners associations, discovering several clauses that supported Eleanor's case. They also filed a complaint with the state regulatory agency responsible for overseeing HOAs, attaching copies of the original agreements and correspondence proving her exemption. By the time they finished, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since receiving the letter, she believed she might actually have a chance at clearing her name. Still, the battle was far from over. Dealing with the HOA meant navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy, politics, and egos, all while trying to stay one step ahead of people who seemed determined to ignore the facts. Yet Eleanor wasn't afraid. With Jack by her side and decades of evidence backing her up, she knew she had a fighting chance. Little did she realize, though, that uncovering the truth would lead her straight into the heart of a much larger scandal, one that went far beyond her modest little cottage. Word of Eleanor's standoff with the HOA spread quickly through the neighborhood, like ripples in a pond after a stone is thrown. At first, it was just whispers, casual mentions during morning walks or over coffee at the local cafe. But soon, the story took on a life of its own. Some neighbors were sympathetic, nodding knowingly when they passed Eleanor in her garden. "Good for you," one woman said, clutching her grocery bags. They'd gotten out of control. Others, however, weren't so supportive. A few even avoided eye contact altogether, as if being associated with Eleanor might somehow tarnish their standing within the community. The divide didn't surprise Eleanor. She'd lived among these people for 30 years, long enough to understand how the HOA operated. It wasn't just an organization, it was a culture, one that thrived on conformity and control. Many residents had bought into the lifestyle, the manicured lawns, the private parks, the sense of exclusivity. And they feared rocking the boat. To them, challenging the HOA wasn't just risky, it was unthinkable. Even those who privately agreed with Eleanor hesitated to speak up, worried about retaliation or being targeted themselves. But not everyone stayed silent. Jack Miller became more than just a legal advisor. He became Eleanor's greatest ally. As a former HOA president, Jack knew the inner workings of the association better than almost anyone. He revealed details about past controversies, including disputes over fees, favoritism among board members, and questionable spending decisions. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," Jack told Eleanor one evening as they sat at his dining table reviewing documents. People grumble, but they rarely push back. That's how the HOA gets away with so much. Jack also shared insights about the new management company hired by the HOA. Known for its aggressive tactics, the firm had a reputation for squeezing money out of homeowners under dubious pretenses. "They're not here to serve the community," Jack explained. "They're here to make a profit. And if that means cooking the books or bullying people into paying, so be it." This revelation made Eleanor's blood boil. Her case wasn't just about her. It was part of a bigger pattern of exploitation. Despite the challenges, Eleanor found strength in the growing support around her. Neighbors began dropping by unannounced, offering words of encouragement or bringing copies of their own HOA correspondence. One couple, the Pattersons, confessed they'd been quietly fighting their own battle against unfair charges. "We didn't know what to do," Mrs. Patterson admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "But seeing you stand up gives us hope." Even younger residents, who initially dismissed Eleanor as a relic of the past, started paying attention. Social media posts about her plight gained traction, sparking conversations about transparency and accountability. Meanwhile, Jack worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his connections to gather more evidence. He reached out to former HOA board members, some of whom were eager to share their frustrations. One ex-board member, a retired accountant named Margaret, provided a bombshell. She claimed to have witnessed instances of financial mismanagement during her tenure, including unauthorized transfers and inflated invoices. Though Margaret hadn't reported it at the time, fearing retribution, she now regretted staying quiet. "I should have spoken up sooner," she told Jack. "Maybe none of this would have happened." As the pieces came together, Eleanor realized she wasn't fighting alone anymore. What started as a personal battle had grown into something larger, a movement fueled by shared grievances and a desire for change. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of optimism. The HOA might have underestimated her, but they hadn't counted on the power of unity. With Jack by her side and a growing network of supporters, Eleanor prepared to take the next step, confronting the HOA directly and demanding answers. Little did she know, the truth she was about to uncover would shake the foundation of the entire community. As Eleanor and Jack dug deeper into the HOA's financial records, they began to uncover a web of deceit that went far beyond Eleanor's $45,000 bill. What started as a search for answers turned into an exposé of corruption so brazen it shocked even Jack, who had seen his fair share of shady dealings during his time on the board. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about greed, mismanagement, and a complete disregard for the homeowners the HOA was supposed to serve. The breakthrough came when Margaret, the former accountant, handed over a flash drive containing years' worth of internal documents. Among them were spreadsheets detailing suspicious transactions, large sums funneled into personal accounts, inflated invoices for services never rendered, and unauthorized raises given to select board members. One particularly damning entry showed that the HOA president at the time had borrowed $200,000 from the community fund to cover personal expenses, only to repay it months later with interest skimmed from other homeowners' dues. It was a pattern repeated over and over, hidden behind layers of jargon and complicated accounting practices designed to confuse anyone who dared to look too closely. Eleanor stared at the numbers, her hands trembling with anger. "They'd been stealing from us," she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "All these years, we've been paying for things we didn't even know about." Jack nodded grimly. "This isn't negligence," he said. "This is theft, plain and simple. And your case, it's the perfect cover-up. By targeting someone like you, someone independent, someone with history, they distract from their own crimes." Armed with this evidence, Eleanor and Jack decided to escalate their fight. They contacted a local journalist named Sarah, who had a reputation for investigative reporting. At first, Sarah was skeptical. HOA disputes were common, and most amounted to little more than squabbles over fence heights or landscaping rules. But when Jack showed her the documents, her eyes widened. "This is huge," she said, scrolling through the files on her laptop. "If this checks out, it's not just a story, it's a scandal." Sarah agreed to write an article, but she warned Eleanor that going public could come with risks. "Once this gets out, there's no turning back," she said. "Are you ready for that?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding firmly. "I didn't ask for this fight," she replied. "But if exposing the truth helps protect my home, and everyone else's, then I'll do whatever it takes." The article hit the press a week later, splashed across the front page of the local newspaper under the headline, "HOA Scandal Uncovered. Corruption, Embezzlement, and a Fight for Justice." Overnight, the quiet suburban neighborhood erupted into chaos. Residents who had once dismissed Eleanor's complaints now demanded answers. Some organized emergency meetings, while others called for the immediate resignation of the current HOA board. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForEleanor and #TransparentHOA, drawing attention from neighboring communities and even state regulators. The HOA scrambled to respond, issuing vague statements claiming the allegations were misunderstandings and promising an internal review. But their attempts to downplay the situation only fueled more outrage. Emails poured in from homeowners asking for explanations, and several anonymous tips surfaced, corroborating the findings in Sarah's report. Even the management company, realizing they were caught in the crossfire, tried to distance themselves by blaming the HOA board for providing inaccurate information. Through it all, Eleanor remained steadfast. While some neighbors praised her courage, others accused her of stirring up trouble. A few board members even attempted to paint her as a troublemaker trying to tarnish the community's reputation. But Eleanor refused to be intimidated. She held a small gathering in her backyard, inviting curious neighbors to hear her side of the story. Standing beside her garden, surrounded by roses her grandmother had planted, she spoke passionately about fairness, accountability, and the importance of protecting what truly mattered. By the time the dust settled, one thing was undeniable. Eleanor Grayson had ignited a firestorm. What began as a personal battle against an unjust bill had grown into a movement demanding transparency and reform. The HOA might have thought they could silence her with intimidation and bureaucracy, but instead, they had awakened a force much stronger than they'd anticipated. The collective voice of a community tired of being taken advantage of. And Eleanor, standing tall amidst the storm, knew this was only the beginning. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Eleanor felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her: nervousness, determination, and even a touch of disbelief that it had come to this. The courtroom was packed with curious neighbors, journalists, and HOA board members who sat stiffly in their suits, whispering among themselves. Eleanor, dressed in her best outfit, a modest navy blue dress paired with pearls passed down from her mother, felt small but resolute as she took her seat beside Jack. Despite the weight of the moment, she reminded herself why she was there. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the HOA's greed. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The case began with the HOA's attorney presenting their argument, his tone confident and polished. He claimed that Eleanor's property was subject to the same rules as every other homeowner, citing outdated subdivision maps and vague clauses buried deep in legal jargon. "Ms. Grayson has benefited from our community's shared resources for decades," he declared, gesturing dramatically. "It's only fair that she contribute her share." Eleanor clenched her fists under the table, biting back the urge to interrupt. She hadn't asked for any of those so-called benefits. She didn't use the tennis courts, swim in the pool, or attend the holiday parties. Her home predated all of it, and she'd made do with what she had long before the HOA existed. But instead of reacting impulsively, she trusted Jack to handle the response. And Jack did not disappoint. Rising calmly, he addressed the judge with the poise of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. "Your Honor," he began, "this case isn't about fairness. It's about facts. He proceeded to lay out Eleanor's evidence piece by piece, starting with the original agreement signed by the developers explicitly exempting her property from HOA jurisdiction. Then came the decades of correspondence confirming her status, followed by receipts proving she had paid nominal fees voluntarily. Finally, he presented the damning financial records uncovered by Margaret, exposing the HOA's pattern of corruption. "This isn't a simple billing error," Jack concluded, his voice steady but firm. "It's an attempt to cover up years of mismanagement and embezzlement. My client is being used as a scapegoat because she dared to question them. If we allow this injustice to stand, it sets a dangerous precedent, not just for Ms. Grayson, but for every homeowner in this state." The HOA's attorney tried to counter, sputtering objections and accusing Eleanor of cherry-picking documents. But the more he spoke, the weaker his argument sounded. Even the judge seemed unimpressed, raising an eyebrow at some of the flimsy claims. When it was Eleanor's turn to testify, she stood tall, her voice clear despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. She spoke not as a victim, but as someone defending her legacy. "This house isn't just a building," she said, looking directly at the judge. "It's my family's history. I've cared for it, preserved it, and respected this community. All I ask is that they respect me in return." By the end of the proceedings, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly, while the HOA representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. After a brief deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. Eleanor owed nothing, not a penny. Furthermore, the HOA was ordered to reimburse her legal fees and issue a public apology. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Eleanor felt tears welling up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and vindication. As she left the courthouse, surrounded by cheering neighbors and flashing cameras, Eleanor realized something profound. This victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless against a system designed to exploit them. And though the battle was won, she knew the war for accountability was far from over. Still, as she walked home beneath the golden afternoon sun, she allowed herself a rare smile. For the first time in months, the future looked bright, and her little cottage had never felt more like home. The victory in court was more than just a win for Eleanor. It was a turning point for the entire community. The HOA's public apology, issued reluctantly and buried deep within the local paper, did little to quell the outrage that had been simmering beneath the surface. Residents who had once stayed silent out of fear or apathy now found their voices, demanding transparency and accountability from the very organization meant to protect their interests. Neighborhood meetings became standing room-only events, with homeowners speaking passionately about overdue reforms. For the first time in years, people felt empowered to challenge the status quo. In the weeks following the trial, state regulators launched an official investigation into the HOA's finances, spurred by the mountain of evidence Eleanor and Jack had uncovered. The findings were damning: embezzlement, fraudulent billing practices, and misuse of funds on lavish business trips for board members. Several key figures resigned under pressure, including the current HOA president and 2 long-serving board members. Their departures marked the beginning of sweeping changes, new leadership elections, stricter oversight measures, and revised policies ensuring greater transparency. The management company, eager to distance itself from the scandal, terminated its contract with the HOA altogether. For Eleanor, life began to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a whirlwind experience. Her garden flourished once again, untended during the stress of the legal battle, but now bursting with color thanks to her careful nurturing. Neighbors who had once barely acknowledged her presence stopped by regularly, bringing baked goods, stories, and gratitude. "You've done something incredible," one young mother told her, holding her toddler's hand. "We'll never forget what you've done for all of us." But Eleanor wasn't interested in being hailed as a hero. She simply wanted peace, the quiet, predictable rhythm of her days restored. Yet she couldn't deny the sense of pride swelling in her chest every time she saw neighbors banding together, working toward meaningful change. Inspired by her courage, some even formed a watchdog group dedicated to monitoring the HOA's activities, ensuring that history wouldn't repeat itself. Eleanor attended their inaugural meeting, offering words of encouragement. "It's not about fighting," she said softly. "It's about standing up for what's right, and remembering that we're stronger together." As the months passed, Eleanor noticed subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Fences between properties seemed less like barriers and more like invitations to connect. People organized potlucks and block parties, rekindling the spirit of camaraderie that had been missing for years. Even the newer residents, many of whom had initially dismissed Eleanor as an outsider, warmed to her charm and wisdom. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching children play tag across freshly mowed lawns, Eleanor realized something remarkable. The community was healing, not just from the scandal, but from the divisions that had plagued it for far too long. Her cottage, meanwhile, stood as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that history mattered, that roots ran deep, and that progress didn't have to come at the expense of heritage. A local historian approached Eleanor about adding her home to a registry of historic landmarks, an honor she accepted with quiet pride. "This house has seen so much," she mused aloud while showing him around. "I like to think it still has stories left to tell." By the time autumn rolled around again, painting the trees in fiery hues, Eleanor felt a profound sense of closure. The $45,000 bill that had once threatened everything she held dear was now nothing more than a distant memory. A chapter closed in the book of her life. But the legacy of her fight lived on, woven into the fabric of the community she called home. As she sipped her morning coffee, gazing out at the golden sunlight spilling over her garden, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had faced down injustice, preserved her family's legacy, and inspired others to do the same. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges, she knew one thing for certain: her little cottage, and the spirit it represented, would endure, steadfast and unyielding, for generations to come.